Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Tim Gill. Tim is an independent scholar, writer, and consultant on childhood, and a global advocate for children's play and mobility. His work cuts across public policy, education, childcare, planning, urban design, and playwork. He's a Design Council ambassador and a former director of Children's Play Council. Tim is a long-standing advocate for child-friendly urban planning and design. His book, Urban Playground: How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities, was published by the Royal Institute of British Architects in 2021. In 2017, he was awarded a traveling fellowship from the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. This allowed him to study how the cities of Calgary, Ghent, Antwerp, Freiburg, Oslo, Rotterdam, and Vancouver have taken children into account in their planning. Tim is co-author of the first London-wide planning guidance on children's play and recreation. The revised edition is helping to shape neighbourhoods for London's children. As well as playgrounds, his interest in the built environment embraces streets, neighbourhood planning, transport, and public space, and children's evolving relationship with nature. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Tim Gill. Tim is a writer and consultant on childhood. Tim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Bina. It's great to be here.
Please tell us more.
Okay, so I'm in my 50s. I'm a dad. As you mentioned, I write, I do consultancy work. All of my work really is around children's relationship with the people and places around them, and especially how children kind of grow up and gradually get to grips with the world around them and the people and places in their lives. And I kind of came to this originally in a sort of slightly odd way. So I'm not, an urban designer or an architect. I'm not a child psychologist or an educator, although I do have a bit of a background in philosophy and psychology. But I worked in an NGO called the Children's Play Council and got this job about 25 years ago that seemed kind of interesting. And the short version is I've stuck around ever since because I have found it interesting. I'm fascinated by children's lives and how they're changing. I have a daughter myself, which obviously makes things there's a personal aspect, although she's in her 20s now, so that process has been and gone. But I get a lot out of engaging with questions around neighbourhoods, cities, and how we can make them work better for children.
And what spiked your interest? Why? Because I feel like when we talk about children and childhood, so many aspects we could approach, right? Why their relationships with their surroundings? What sparked your interest?
I guess I have my view of children is you could call it rights-based. I believe children are sort of human beings who deserve respect and whose status is often not very well respected. And I also believe that children have a lot more competence and they're more capable than we think they are. And so it's some of those big questions about what does it mean to be a kind of responsive, resilient, confident, engaged human being, and how do our childhood experiences sort of shape some of that? Those are some of the questions that I'm interested in.
Yeah, and in your book, you actually, and I want to read the full title, Urban Playground: How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities. That's a very bold title, and I love that. Why can they save cities?
Right. Well, I guess the first thing is, cities do need saving. I mean, a lot of cities they're not working well right now. And when you compare how they are with how they need to be in the light, especially, of course, of the climate crisis, but also just the other, the challenges around inequality, environmental degradation, health, the cities are kind of broken. I love the city I live in, which is London, but it's not, it could be so much better. And in the book, I argue, first of all, that children are hurt the most. They suffer the most from when cities don't work. They suffer the most from pollution, from traffic danger, from the society that doesn't work in cities, their health, their well-being, but also that children are a kind of canary in the coal mine, if you like. They are a powerful lens.
So many aspects of that is so true in the way, like when we're talking about cities that would work for children, and we're talking about inclusive of children, then we're also, expanding in what we mean by inclusion, and for example, like access, right? Accessibility. And from that accessibility, so many other communities and population can also benefit from.
Yeah.
And so I find myself stopping her multiple times. I don't let her on her scooter because I'm scared of the traffic. And I'm already like in that like 10-minute distance that we have to get by in the morning. I frustrate her so many times because I need to restrict her, not because of what she's doing. She's just being a kid and like being curious and wants to move around, but the environment scares me. So I therefore stop her and start restricting her. And we start the day with a conflict, right? So already, and this is just like one street in a city that is causing this. And I can see parents throughout like many urban areas in the world just inhibiting behavior, exploration, freedom of children just out of fear. And that comes with maybe density, but also fear of other things. And I'm curious in terms of like disservice for ourselves by coming off with that restriction in such an early age.
I think that's a good question. And so I talk about childhood being, amongst other things, a kind of journey. It's a figurative journey, and when children are born, they're pretty much entirely dependent on adults for everything, and we look after every aspect of their minute by minute lives. But as children grow up, they gradually, we hope, become more independent and kind of gain more autonomy and take on more responsibility for lots of aspects of their lives. And I think that journey is best made as a set of gradual steps, so that you can imagine children spreading their wings and venturing further from their carers or parents, further from their homes, going into different spaces and places and institutions, and engaging with the city as citizens in their own right. And that a healthy childhood is one where children can make gradual but steady progress to being an independent, confident, capable, engaged citizen. And that if children are living a lot of their lives entirely kind of constrained and overseen and just in islands, little islands of space and time, then they're not going to get that taste of freedom, that chance to become more confident and capable. So amongst other things, we will see children who are less confident, and there's a growing consensus. I'm not I'm not a mental health expert, but I know from the child psychologists and psychiatrists that I speak to, that this is a growing concern. And of course, there are other expressions of children's ill health. We know that child obesity is a growing problem. Yeah. And these global trends in children's health are telling us that the human habitats that we've created or we've allowed to evolve are not good for children.
And one big, very evident case study, I guess, that the urban settings are not working was like last year. And if that wasn't proof of, showing our cities don't work, I don't know what is. I guess, so my question would be, so like we understand cities have to change, and part of that change, we're looking at more equitable environments and many communities and their needs, and including children. But we also realize that even in that conversion, and if we have the time, means, collaboration enabled to have that conversion happen, we can't rebuild existing cities right away. So what type of interventions in an urban setting can we start with to start enable that inclusion?
So what is it that makes a place work well for children in physical terms? And I say there are two aspects or two dimensions. And the first dimension is kind of obvious. It's, you know, a place that works well for children is a place where children can have lots of different types of exposure. They can see their friends, they can play sport, they can, you know, there are services and facilities that they need. But that's just one dimension. That's the things to do dimension. But the other dimension, which is just as important, is the mobility dimension. Right? How easy is it for children to get around their city or their neighborhood and to access and enjoy those spaces and things to do and facilities? And it's only where you have both high degrees of choice and variety in the neighborhood and high levels of mobility that you're in what I call the child-friendly city. And so, you know, the key barrier, I think, and it's one you've hinted at, I think, already, is that we've designed cities and neighborhoods around the needs of the car, not around the needs of everybody else. And children suffer the worst from car-dominated and car-oriented planning. And I think that's if we don't tackle that, then everything else is kind of fiddling around the edges. But the good news, I think, is that is happening anyway, and we know it has to happen. Yeah. And that there's some great work happening in cities, and maybe we'll talk about that, who are cities that are moving away from car dominant. And the take-home message from my book is that's tough, doing that move away from car dominant really helps to underpin that crucial change.
Yeah, and it's serving the future in two ways, right? Like one, the future generation, but also, you know, when we talk about the climate crisis, it also serves in that way, and so relates to our future in two different ways. New York has been an interesting case study. Last year, with the pandemic, some streets were closed off to traffic, restaurants expanded onto the streets, and for all of you that know New York, restaurants are very tight environments in New York City, so that having extra space for restaurants were not only great for the customer experience, but also it enabled restaurants to be able to do more business when they suffered for so long. So potentially saved so many restaurants as well. And one of the first things I've experienced when that like shift started to happen, I realized, because I wasn't scared now if my child ran off to the street. So we were just like walking in much more leisurely, me being more relaxed, the child not being restricted. And that enabled sort of that like more relaxing feel of just like walking around. And I recognized in myself that I preferred those routes to go somewhere, even if that took longer, just because it would have been less stress for us. And we were having this conversation with a friend who, you know, also has a very active child, and she was saying, you know, if this does not continue, maybe we move somewhere else, because like she was so tired of restricting her child or limiting his emotions, of felt bothered by it herself too, that she was like doing that. So that was a good case example. And now there are conversations in the city to make that switch permanently, keeping those streets closed off to traffic, having restaurants still expand on the streets. Are there any sort of like case examples, maybe that were like triggered from last year or before, that you've seen that worked for in several ways, like both, you know, in reducing noise pollution or air pollution, but also maybe helping retail or helping some other businesses, and also creating these like more children and people friendly streets, really?
I think there are a lot of examples that we can look at that show how cities and neighborhoods can work better. In Urban Playground, I offer up, I describe one neighborhood that I suggest could be the ultimate sort of child-friendly neighborhood. And it's actually relatively long-standing eco suburb. It's a district of Freiburg city in Germany, and it's called Vauban. And it's quite well known amongst urban designers, particularly sustainable people interested in sustainability, it's got lots of dimensions of sustainability built into it. But it's a district of about 5,000 or 6,000 people. What's interesting to me is medium density, it's mixed use, but it's almost entirely car free. Green, it's very attractive, it's well overlooked, it's quiet, it's full of nature. And I've been lucky enough to visit Vauban twice. And both times, what struck me, it's actually that Peñalosa quote, that the number of children with and without their parents, active and visible, even really quite little children playing in the parks on their own, and that level of vibrancy and joy in that neighborhood is amazing. Now, that's the kind of lighthouse that I offer, if you like, or the kind of North Star. But you can see cities like Barcelona, which is again has something of a history of these sorts of shifts, strongly driven by the challenge of adapting to the climate crisis there, where heat stress is a problem. Or looking at Paris, which is following a similar route. It's creating, it's opening up green space, it's tackling traffic, it's promoting walking and cycling, doing amazing things, and has also, both of those cities, I think, have taken advantage of that key insight from the pandemic, which you hinted at, that insight that, hey, you know what, public space is really important. it's just, it really adds to our lives if we can get out and get some fresh air, especially if we live in a dense city, where, because we are facing 100 years of car-oriented planning, it's going to take a lot to unwind that, because that's not just a cultural thing, it's a reality that many people depend on having access to their car or their vans to their business, and so figuring out how we move away from that is going to be a bumpy journey. But there's so much that we can already learn from places like Vauban and Freiburg, from Barcelona, from Paris. Even in a way, in my book, I write also about low and middle income countries. I talk about Tirana, the capital city of Albania, the poorest country in Europe, absolutely broken city after the collapse of communism. But I also was lucky enough to go to Recife in Brazil, which is a big, tough city. It's got big problems. But there again, the mayor has, through a focus on child development and child health.
Yeah, and if anything, we're talking about very accessible means. We're talking about access to nature. Like, that's basic human right. You don't have to be a rich nation to be able to enable that. So it's actually an accessible thing. We just need to change our mindsets. I have a question. So I guess, when we talk about urban context, we're also talking about, some of the examples we've given have robust public transportation systems. So it makes it more, in addition to maybe, cycling and walking options, for further distances, it still makes a plausible conversation because cars can still park at a certain area and the in-between can be in different means. What are your thoughts about areas or cities that were, I'm giving examples from US, but feel free to expand this further, that were very much built around relying on car transportation only? One example that comes to mind is Los Angeles, very isolated, stretched out city, with everything you want to do is kind of like a 10-minute drive always. But we also see that in some developing countries like Turkey, where there are cities that heavily rely on just car transportation, and there's not enough public transportation. Buses, yes, but still no subway option or train option that could really kind of create diverse public transportation. So how do you think this intervention can start? Because I feel like if it doesn't, maybe kids kind of live in a less stressful environment, but in isolation. Then we see these clusters or bubbles of areas in a city that don't interact with each other. And kids either play in their backyard or if there's like a very close playground nearby, that's it, but it's not necessarily exposure to the rest of the city. So what type of interventions do you think can happen in these more stretched out and cities that kind of have these isolated pockets?
Families live in neighborhoods. And so the neighborhood is the unit of analysis, if you like. So the question then becomes, for somewhere like LA or Phoenix or wherever it is, what can we do in the residential neighborhoods where families are living to make them more child friendly? And it comes back to that framework I said earlier. What that boils down to is, how can we make it easier for children to get around on foot or by bike? Because that's how children want to get around. And how can we increase the level of offers, the activities, the spaces within that neighborhood? And so you can look at pocket parks, you can look at simply just how connected is the walking network in that neighborhood. Maybe we need to build out the sidewalks on those main junctions. We need to look at the park. How accessible is the local park? What about the route from the school to the park? What about helping more families walk and cycle to school? That might take us to something like school streets. That's a really interesting model that we're seeing in Europe now, where the streets outside of schools are being closed to car traffic at the beginning and end of the school day. So in effect, it's no cars between 8:30 and 9:30. So more families are walking. And so more children then start walking on their own, and it becomes a virtuous circle. And so if you break it down and you focus on the neighborhood, there's lots of ways that even neighbors that to start with really aren't, they're not that child friendly. You can make things better by improving children's mobility or increasing the level of offers and spaces within that neighborhood.
I love that so much. I wish we started like adopting the school streets mindset here also in like New York City. I'm curious about your thoughts on something, and this like sort of like expanding the conversation beyond, I guess, urban context. In not maybe in urban areas, in any city really. When we also like start to think about inclusion of children in spaces, I also often think about interiors. And so like even when we talk about public spaces like museums or some parks that have like historic, maybe like monuments, and many, and not I mean even like excluding retail, but it is the case. I often feel like I'm not like, families are not necessarily really thought of in the designs, because once you also, let's say, like walk into a museum, there's so many things that you need to watch out for, be careful about, so many people saying no at you and your child. This even like intensifies in retail, right? Like you're worried that something's going to happen. So once we're like off the streets and we go into interiors, that kind of like feeling that children are not welcome here kind of like expands, and it becomes part of your neighborhood or city experience too in some way, because we're not always on the streets. We're going to places, and at those places, how comfortable do we feel as a family, or how many times we have to warn our children to not do something. So I'm curious about your thoughts there. I know it's like kind of now we're like going into the buildings, but I'm curious about your thoughts, like how might we sort of invite a change of mindset or do some interventions there too.
Right. So I'm going to take a slight step back and make an economic case for child and family friendly initiatives that there'll be indoors and outdoors. And it's really kind of simple. It's that, cities need to attract and retain families. I devote a whole chapter in my book to the city of Rotterdam, and which has probably invested more time and money in making its built fabric more child friendly. Okay, and the city leaders realize that that is not good news. That the insight here is a city that is unable to attract and retain families is a city whose long-term future is bleak. And there's good research, as actually good, I quote some in the book, about how in American cities, the cities with larger numbers of families are the cities that are more economically successful. So there is a link between, if you like, the family friendliness of a place and how, and its economic viability. And I think that goes for most businesses and cultural concerns as well. So, if you're not, as a retailer or a restaurant or a shopping street or a cultural institution, if you're not attracting families, then you're missing out on a huge potential market, and particularly a market that's going to stick with you long term, because the children who enjoy going to museums or will grow into adults who do the same. So there is, I think, a fairly compelling case. And actually, I'm doing a few pieces of work with municipalities here in the UK who are struggling with their high streets in the wake of, well, firstly, the pandemic, and secondly, the internet. Now, why would you bother going shopping to a real town centre if all you're interested in is the buying of the goods and how cheap or and their price? Well, you'll go online. But if you're interested in the experience, and if you're interested in the social contact, the stimulation, just the engagement, the vitality, the vibrancy of getting out and about, well, then you will go to a shopping street or a town or a city centre. And making places more child friendly, and especially making them more playful, really helps with that. We haven't talked very much about play, even though I've got a long background in play. But there is something kind of wonderful and sort of essentially vibrant about children's play, and I'm sure you see it with your daughter. This incredible energy and appetite for experience that you see even in very young children. And there's a growing sort of set of cities that have realized that creating playful destinations, whether it's conventional playgrounds or maybe cultural institutions or maybe just the streetscape itself, is a really strong draw to not only pull in families, but also make places feel more fun for everybody. And I'm working on a scheme in Leeds, one of the big northern cities in England right now, that's about making over one of the central squares in Leeds. And child friendliness and playfulness is absolutely central to the design that we're coming up with.
I love that so much. And I feel like as adults, we underestimate our need for being playful and being playing more and just, interacting with our environments more. Like, we don't necessarily always have to be on the go. And children and having close contact with children is like the quickest and the most efficient reminder of that to you. So the more that kind of is instilled in our environments, the higher the chances that not only families end up there because they just feel more comfortable and welcome, so they end up choosing to go there again. So it's not only about the child having a playful experience, but also a mother not stressing out about everything every 5 seconds. She feels comfortable there, so she wants to be there. But also it just creates an environment for all adults and all individuals that is something that we don't necessarily get to experience in our day-to-day that often. So we need that, even if we don't realize we need that. And I'm so glad we kind of talked about playfulness in that way. I do want to ask, I guess, final question, and this can be in this field, maybe for someone in urban planning or architecture, or even in another field who wants to, I guess, think of spaces or products or interiors in a more inclusive manner. What would be your advice to them?
So I would really encourage people to kind of rediscover or give voice to their inner child. I sometimes in my talks invite people to think about the places where they used to enjoy playing the most when they were kids, and just picture that place and describe it. And that's often a really quick, emotionally resonant way to tap into this sort of power of play and the kind of incredible journey that children go on, and their appetite for experience. So sort of thinking and reflecting on and reconnecting with your own childhood, observing and using your imagination to see what a city or a neighborhood or even, you know, an interior space is, what it looks like from the eyes of a child, from the level of a child. There's a program called Urban 95 that's run by the Bernard van Leer Foundation that I'm helping on, that's really focused on younger children, on kind of children of 3 years and younger, but invites everybody to look at the city from a height of 95 centimeters, and then, you know, what would you change? So that I think is a really it's a great starting point for reflections on you know, the texture and fabric of cities. I'm a great believer in networking, various kinds, you know, in person, online. I mean, Twitter, it's a blessing and a curse, but I have got a lot from, and other social networks, LinkedIn as well. I think if you're, you know, reasonably, if you kind of think about it and have a bit of a focused approach, that those networks can be really supportive and energizing. And observe a neighborhood of your city where you know there's something interesting going on. Actually get down there, spend some time, watch what's happening, watch how, you know, children and families use the space. That approach that Jan Gehl, you know, the Danish architect and urbanist, he focuses a lot on that sort of really basic observational studies of how people of all ages use space. That's incredibly useful. I mean, it goes back to Jane Jacobs and Holly White. So, you know, I still take inspiration from those methods. Check out my book, or indeed buy it. I tried really hard to make it, you know, both sort of well researched and referenced, but also engaging, and you know, so you know, people have been telling me that it kind of pulls you in. There's a lot of images. There's you know, some key concepts that I try and illustrate with diagrams and so on. So you know, it's a really exciting field to be in right now, actually. I mean, you know, I've been working in this topic for, as I say, 25 years, but for a lot of that time, children have really been very marginal to thinking about streets, neighborhoods, cities. That is beginning to change. In fact, you know, it's been bubbling up for a few years now, and so and especially if you are, you know, working in the built environment and you have children yourself or know children closely, I think that can be a real catalyst and an insight into how we can make cities work better for kids.
100%. Thank you so much, Tim. This was such a treat. And both as someone in like the design field and as a mom, it excites me so much. I really hope everybody checks out your book. Any other like news, projects, potential future articles, books that we should be watching out for?
Well, I'm speaking to you from the UK, and in less than 3 weeks now, I think we've got COP26, the big global climate change summit. I'm hoping I may have a modest sort of input into that. Don't know quite if it's going to come off, but in a way, it's not really about me. It's about, you know, watching, reflecting on, and engaging in that process. And I know, and I know many people listening to this, you know, feel that it's really frightening and can be very worrying to sort of reflect on what we're doing to the planet. But again, I think there is a positive message from my work and my book, which is that if we really create a picture of what a child-friendly place, neighborhood, city is like, and we see how it's more sustainable, we also see how it's just more enjoyable, and it can be a pathway to a better life. So those scary things about the transition we're all going to need to make become less scary, and I think, you know, potentially even things that we would welcome into our lives. You know, living locally, being closer to nature, being more healthy, being more active, spending more time with each other. I think those are things that everybody wants to add to their lives.
1000%. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you very much, Bernard.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.